In this episode, Langdon is going to help us ace behavior interview questions, in which he will guide us through a number of common questions in this nature. So, Langdon, when I searched for the purpose of behavior interviews in my own preparation, I found out that these questions are basically essentially based on the premise that past behavior is the best predictor of our future behavior. So on that point, do you mind just further introducing the gist and purpose of such questions that are competency-based in nature?
Sure. So, like in our first podcast together, I briefly mentioned that interviewers and companies who are taking on new staff are looking for more than just technical skills. They're looking to understand how you are going to behave in a role, what sort of behaviours, what sort of skills you bring apart from the technical skills. These are vital in the Australian context. It's not enough just to talk about your technical skills. It's also very important to show them that you are the kind of person who's going to be an effective employee, who's going to be a great team member, who can communicate well, who can solve problems, who is organised in their work, who takes the initiative when they need to. There are a whole lot of other skills, what we call generic or soft skills. And this is what mostly the behavioural questions are designed to find out about, right? They're trying to discover more about the type of employee you are, the type of person you are. So we're always going to use an example from the past, as you said, where the past is the best predictor for the future. So we're going to talk about something we've done in the past to try to convince them that we will be that person they're looking for, who can effectively solve problems or who can resolve conflict in the work, can handle a conflict situation very well, or who's very effective at managing their time so they get their tasks finished by the deadline, etc. So, they can be tricky to answer sometimes, and we'll talk about some of the pitfalls I expect as we go through.
Awesome. So we do look forward to being guided with some hands-on examples in a real-life scenario, hopefully pertinent to the big environment context as far as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. But the first thing I'd like to talk about really is how we go about structuring our answer. I've had so many clients who they start to talk about some experience they've had, a project they worked on, and they get lost along the way and they go off on a tangent. And sometimes they get so lost in their answer that they even forget what the original question was. Right? So that's obviously a very uncomfortable and negative experience for the interviewee, and it definitely doesn't leave a good impression. So when we use a structure for our answer, that's our security. That means we know what we're talking about. We know the next thing we're going to say. It's much harder to get lost in your answer. And it also means you're going to make the key points that are relevant. So the overall structure that we believe you should be using is first to have a very brief introduction, a very short introduction where you talk perhaps about the amount of experience you've had in that particular area, or some of the key points about this particular topic that they're asking about, whether it's time management or resolving conflict or communication skills. So a very brief introduction, and then you're going to go into your example. And that example is going to be the most important part of your answer. And we teach the STAR method, which is STAR, S for situation. So start off as a good storyteller does by saying, once upon a time, there was an old castle and there was a princess lived in the castle. What we need to do is understand the context first of the story. So it's vital that you start off by talking about what was the project you were working on, what was the details of the building or the construction, what was the size of it, who was the client, who were you working with, what were your main responsibilities. So straight away, they just get a sense of the background to this story. Then you go into the task, which is the T for task, and that's your main focus. What was it that you were trying to achieve in your project? What was the focus of this example you're giving? A stands for actions, and that's the most important part of the answer. That's the real heart. That's where you describe what you did, step by step in order. First, I did this. then I did this, and then I did that. That's what they're really looking for. What it was that you did so that they can understand what your skills are. So that's where you want to spend most of the time. And the final step in the STAR structure, the R, stands for results. So that's where you talk about what was the outcome of those steps. Was there a positive outcome? Hopefully there was. The project got completed on time and to budget, etc. Or it can be okay sometimes to talk about that there was actually a less than satisfactory outcome, because that means you can talk about what you learned from that as well. If you learned good lessons from that, and from that experience I learned the importance of keeping track of such and such, or monitoring this aspect of the project, how vital that is. It can be very effective to talk about how you've learned lessons along the way as well, because that also makes for you a good employee. So that's the structure of your example, STAR. We'll talk through that. We'll give some examples in a moment. We also believe you should finish off with a conclusion. Now, this is where there's some confusion about this structure. We've talked about a result, and that result is the result of your story, the example, particular example you gave. At the end, I was able to complete the report on the different building materials and make a recommendation to the project manager about the best construction method for that wall, whatever it was. The conclusion steps back a little bit and just finishes off the whole answer by summing up in a different way. So I might say, so that's an example of a time when I needed to use my organizational skills, just to emphasize, this is how I do it. I do A, B, and C. And so I believe that I have the skills necessary to perform well in this role. So you're stepping back a little bit and coming back to the question, coming back to the topic that they've asked about, to really try to make that really strong finish to prove that you have those skills they're looking for. That's the structure. What I might do now, Daisy, is give an example of an answer, talk it right through, and the listeners or the viewers of the podcast can see as I go through the structure, as I give the example, if they can spot when I'm moving from one section to the next. When am I moving from into the actions, for example? What's the result, and so on. Once I've given that, we'll see how we go with perhaps one of you answering another question, and see if we can see if you can use the same structure, because that'll be the real challenge. Yeah. How do we think about that?
Yep, sounds terrific. Let's move.
All right. So let's. What I might use as the question is, tell me about a time you were under a lot of pressure. All right, so this is a very common question. And why is this a common question? Because being under a lot of pressure is the normal situation to be under when you're in the construction industry, right? There are always a lot of deadlines. There are always things maybe going wrong, or there's a delay in the delivery of some of the materials, or maybe when you're doing some of the construction digging work, you realise that the soil is actually going to present problems for the original plan, and so you have to replan. So there's always this sense of, there's always a sense of pressure. So very common question.
Yes, spot on. You actually mentioned the great host of stakeholders involved and interwoven. When one aspect goes wrong, there are much, much more people concerned that may get disappointed and frustrated.
Absolutely, and it impacts everyone. When you have a whole construction process and one step gets delayed, it can have a huge impact on the whole project, and therefore a big blowout in the costs of the whole project as well. So employers are obviously interested to hear about how people manage that situation. So I'm going to give an example answer. Sure. So, and it's okay to take a bit of time to think about and prepare your answer. I want to emphasize that. So I'm going to, first of all, Daisy, actually, let's have it that you ask me the question. Langdon, please tell us about a time you're under a lot of pressure and how you handled that. And I will then give an example answer.
Yeah, sure. So Langdon, please tell me about the time when you were under a lot of pressure, what happened, and how you sort of overcome and tackle the pressure.
Sure. Well, in my experience, I found that working under a lot of pressure is pretty much the normal situation. Under construction, there are a lot of challenges. They're always very complex projects that involve a lot of people, so a lot of things can go wrong. And in my experience, it's really critical how you respond to those situations. I can remember a time we were working on a project. It was actually a residential build, and what happened was there was a delay in the delivery of some of the critical building materials. And this was really put a lot of pressure on us, where we had to actually start to plan a different way. We had a plan of how we were going to do the building, but we had to change that plan because some of the materials weren't going to arrive on time. And so I had to quickly reschedule a lot of the activities, the building activities, in a very short amount of time, because we had subcontractors there who we were paying, and each day that they weren't being occupied, it was adding to the costs. So in that situation, the first thing I did was to step back and sat down, gave myself the time to have a look at exactly what the problem was and how we were going to reschedule it. So that was the first step. I had to think, all right, this is the problem. How are we going to go about changing the construction plan to better, so we can still meet our deadline. Then I realized that if we were actually able to focus on a different part of the building first, we could still have the subcontractors employed by just focusing on a different area, which we were originally going to do later. So once I'd made that plan and realized that we had the materials for that, I communicated that to all the stakeholders. So I called a meeting with everyone and explained why we're making the change. I apologized for the inconvenience and realized, and I said, I'm really sorry, this is something, the situation's outside our control, but we're going to do this differently now. We're going to be focusing on this. So I made sure everyone understood what the new plan was, communicated that with them. I gave them the opportunity to talk about any problems that they foresaw with this new plan. We discussed those, and by the end of that process, everyone knew what to do, and we were actually able to go on and complete the project on time, even though there had been a hold up with some of the materials. So that's just one example of a time when I was working under a lot of pressure because of a situation where there was a hold up with some delivery. As I said, that my main way I respond to those situations is I step back, I very carefully plan what we're going to do, and then I make sure I really communicate that effectively to all the stakeholders so everyone understands what the new plan is and how we're going to complete the project. And so thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds quite well fabricated using that principle or formula. And I do have a question as to how important it is to be able to strategically select the context that you introduce to your employer when it comes to moving between the sectors or moving between different skills and complexity of the project. So let's say you've got a wealth of experience in small residential builds. How can you make convincing an example where you resolve such conflicts in these small projects? And how could you convince the prospective employer who you might want to work for on bigger projects? And maybe for some candidates who's yet to be considered for the first step into the door, can they potentially draw on the experience in another industry, let's say hospitality?
Sure, good questions. Look, so obviously the most ideal example that you can draw on is one that's very close to the role that you'll be fulfilling. But as you've said, probably most of the time, especially when people are just graduating, they're not going to have that experience. The good thing is that if you are a graduate, the employers aren't going to expect you to have that experience. They looked at your resume, they know that you haven't worked on multi-million-dollar projects, or you don't have that depth of experience. So what they're looking for when they're asking those sorts of questions is more about your personal character, your personal qualities, the sort of person you are, the way that you respond to things. Because if we respond to something in a certain situation, it may not be the same scale, but we will tend to respond the same way, even when there's a different sort of scale of project, if you like. So it is important to draw on some, I personally believe it's very important to draw on your personal real experience in some way. I've had clients give examples, answers to questions, and I've just sat there listened to it. This doesn't feel real. And I've asked them at the end, I said, is that a real example that you've just given me? And they've said, actually, no, I just read that one on the internet. And I thought it was a good example to use, so I thought I could use it. I think you run a big risk when you do that, because unless you're a really good actor, like Leonardo DiCaprio or someone, it can be easy to spot that you are telling a story that you've just read somewhere. So my advice is to always try to use some sort of genuine example. If you don't have any specific example that relates to the industry that you're applying for, then if you've got nothing else, I would say use something else from another role that you've done.
I suppose it's more often than not the actually technical aptitude that employer want to investigate and reassure them from your answer in this situation. Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. They will have technical questions, no doubt, about a time, that you have, how did you schedule a particular project? What did you use AutoCAD for, or whatever? There will be technical questions. The emphasis, as you've said, of these ones is more about how you respond to situations. What steps do you take? What's your approach? And that's what they're looking for. So the situation is less critical in behavioural questions.
Yeah, and potentially also how you tackle the question that may make you feel caught off guard during the interview in that sort of setting when you feel heavily nerved. It's how you can sort of just assemble the answers thinking of your faith. Yeah.
So Navya, let's invite you in at this point to answer another question, and we've been looking at how you build up your example. And also how you use that structure to talk about your story, to present your example.
Yeah.
Great. So let's just use the question, talk about a time that you had some conflict and how did you resolve that situation, right? So this is, again, a fairly common question in the construction industry, especially when they're under all that pressure. Some people get rather hot-headed or impatient or frustrated. So not an uncommon situation, right? So can you think of a time, first of all, an example, going back through the projects you've done or any industry experience you have, where there was some problem with another person?
I just got my first freelancing project. It was basically a renovation project, renovating the residential building into a commercial one. So the client was opening a new juice center shop in the building. So initially, I just drafted all the plan according to their requirements and all. In juice center, all the display units, the counter, everything, I just aligned the things in horizontal way. But after a few days, the client asked me for few changes, like need to change all the horizontal alignment into a vertical one, which was really a difficult thing, because everything that I have placed need to be changed, all the design thing, like the placing of the furnitures, the display units, everything. That situation was really hectic, and during that time, I was having an assignment submission as well, and the client asked me to make those changes within 1 or 2 days. Yeah, that was the conflict that I faced.
Okay, so thank you. So for me, that sounds less like a conflict situation and more like a situation where you had to work under a lot of pressure to resolve this situation with the client very quickly because of your own situation as well, and a whole lot of impact that had on the project. So it didn't seem like there was a lot of conflict in there, and that there was a lot of argument or disagreement about what was going to happen. You probably resolved that quite quickly because they were the client. So let's switch from this being an example of conflict, and yes, let's use this as a really good example of a situation where you had to work under pressure. All right, so if we go back and talk about through the information you've given us already, you gave us a really great situation description of the project that you were working on already. So that was great. We had a good sense of what the project was, who the client was, what your role was. So that was really clear. And you also, the task that you were working on in that situation, the client had come to you with this request, I wanted everything changed. And you had to work out if that was going to be possible and how that was going to work, right? So if we look at that STA structure, you've given us very clearly the first two steps already, the first two parts of that process. Now we need to really dig into the most important part, which is the actions you took. So when the client first came to you and said, oh, look, okay, this plan's not going to work, I want everything changed, how did you respond to that? Talk us through step by step how you got from there through to completing the project. What happened?
Initially when client told that he needed all to be changed in the other direction, I just thought, the space constraint would be there because we can't place all the juice center equipment in the other direction. It would be a bit congested. I tried to convince my client, and we had a meeting, and finally I said that only the front portion we can change, and the working space and the kitchen would be same. So this was the action that I took to resolve this conflict.
Okay, so let's break it down, because this is really going to be the most important part of your answer, what you did. That's how you're showing your behavior. It's a behavioral question. So they're looking at what your behavior was. But what they're looking for is how you respond to those situations. And your first response was to seek more information, to understand where the client was coming from, why they were making this change, what their thoughts were. So it's really critical that you mention that. That was the first thing you did. Right? That was your first action, was to understand more, to ask lots of questions so you understood. The second one was, then I heard you talk about how you presented the reasons for not doing that, right? You tried to show them that there may be issues with that. You had planned things this way, and so therefore the project was progressing in that direction. So you presented your side, right?
Yeah.
And by listening first, you actually make the other person more susceptible to listen to you effectively when you present your side, right? Because you've given them the respect of listening and asking questions. And so they're more likely to listen and understand where you're coming from as well. That was the second step. You presented your side. The third step was pretty much this client put their foot down and says, no, but I want to see these vertical designs, right?
Yeah.
And so then your third step was to actually decide to say, all right, how can I accommodate the client's requests with the minimal impact on the overall design, therefore the minimal impact on the project timelines, minimal impact on project costs, etc. right?
Yeah.
So you went back and you came up with this plan where only the front part of the shop was going to be aligned vertically. By asking those questions and really thinking back through very carefully what I did, what was the first thing I did, what happened after that, and writing that out for yourself in a Word document, what you need to do is really build up that story step by step, because this is how you're going to present your example and present how you respond to these situations when you give your answer in the interview. You need to be able to talk all that through very clearly, step by step, to show how it was that you responded. And then we come to the R, which is the result. And what would you say was the result of those actions and the steps that you took?
Yeah, the result was a mixture of both our objectives. Like my objective was just to change the front portion, but initially the client was expecting me to change the whole shop portions. So we just had a meeting, and finally our result was just to change the front portion, and he agreed to that.
Excellent. All right, so there was a good outcome, and you can emphasize the client was happy with that, and I was able to rework the designs within the time frame, even though I was under pressure to complete another project. That way I didn't have to rework the whole design. I'd found a good compromise, etc. right? So that's that result. You had a good result. So that's a great example to use of working under pressure where there's something unexpected happens. All right, so Navya, we've got a good example there for working under pressure. We've talked through the STAR, and we've got that really good structure for your story now. What we're going to quickly do is just work out what you're going to say before your story as an introduction, and also what you can put in your conclusion to have a really strong finish at the end of your answer, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about the introduction first of all. What's something that you can really effectively do in your introduction is talk about how much experience you've got in that particular topic that they're talking about, right? So here we're talking about working under pressure. So before you talk about your particular individual example in that freelancing project, you're going to just mention about how much experience you have working under pressure, right?
Yeah.
So when we come to the conclusion of the answer, right? So you've finished now your story. You've got through STAR, including your result. You in this example, the client was happy with the new design that you did, and you were happy because you were able to just redesign the front part of the shop and get everything done on time. Great, happy, everyone was happy. Then we come back to the topic of the question, which is about handling pressure, right, in the conclusion. So here, there are a few things you can do. One is that you can just talk through in a very summary way the process. Again, just remind them of the process that you used. In this case, it might go something like, so as I demonstrated in that example, when I'm working under pressure, the first thing I do is make sure that I really understand the full situation by asking lots of questions to find out what everyone's requirements are, and so I can understand the timelines and the expectations. And when I've done that, I sit back and I carefully plan my response to that, how I'm going to be able to complete my tasks in time. I break those tasks down into smaller tasks. I work out how I can prioritize them. And then I go back and I discuss that with the stakeholders to make sure that they're happy with my plan and they're clear about it and they can ask any questions. So that's how I go about resolving, situations or responding to situations where there's lots of pressure. Right? Yeah. But that's one thing you can do in your conclusion, is just give a quick summary of your approach. This is how I handle the situation. The other thing that you can do very effectively in conclusion is talk about the why this is an important thing. What are the possible impact or risk involved with this particular topic? By doing this, what we're doing is adding more value to our answer. Apart from just talking about, this is something I've done, this is how I responded, you are bringing in more insight and understanding. You're showing this greater insight into the impact or why this actually matters. Why is it important to them to ask about in the interview?
Yeah, thank you very much, both Navya and Langdon, for your substantial dedication in demonstrating and providing feedbacks. Another important lesson I reckon for the audience will be that this is meant to be a continuous and iterated process. As you evolve and propel in your career trajectory, you can constantly fabricate and reinstate and realign your answers to suit your particular scenario in a given phase of the career. So thank you very much, Langdon and Navya, for this episode. And in case you haven't had enough, we've got, as a good news, the next episode for you, where we'll all continue the learning journey with Langdon's fellow colleague Naren from CSA, who will take you through more questions and demonstrate what's an exemplary answer for you to nail the opportunity. Thanks.